The subway was packed, as it usually was during rush hour. People stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces weary from the long day of work. Some stared at their phones, others listened to music through their earbuds, trying to block out the noise of the crowded train. The rhythmic sound of the train's wheels clacking on the tracks filled the air, but it did little to ease the tension that always seemed to hang in the atmosphere when the train was this full. Jasmine stepped onto the train with a gentle sigh, her swollen belly making her movements slow and deliberate. She was heavily pregnant, only a few weeks away from her due date. The discomfort she felt was visible. Her back ached, her feet were sore, and the crowded train did nothing to ease her exhaustion. She stood in the middle of the aisle for a moment, scanning the sea of people for an empty seat. The heat from so many bodies pressed close together made it hard to breathe, and she could feel the weight of her tiredness pulling her down. She glanced toward the front of the car and saw an empty seat. Her heart lifted for a moment as she made her way toward it. But as she got closer, she noticed the man sitting in the seat, his eyes fixed on his phone, his body taking up more space than necessary. He didn't seem to notice her at all. He looked around her, pretending as if she wasn't there, even though she was clearly struggling. Jasmine hesitated for a brief moment. She could feel her frustration rising, but she tried to push it down. She knew it wasn't his fault that the train was so crowded, and she understood that people could get lost in their own worlds. Still, she couldn't ignore the fact that she was carrying a child, and standing for the entire ride home wouldn't be easy. Taking a deep breath, she approached the man, and with a calm voice, said, "Excuse me, sir, would you mind giving up your seat? I'm pregnant and feeling a bit unwell." For a moment, there was silence. The man continued to look at his phone, not even acknowledging her request. It was as though she hadn't spoken at all. Jasmine felt a wave of frustration rush over her, but she tried again, this time a little louder. "Excuse me, could you please let me sit down? I really need to rest." Still, the man did not respond. His face remained blank, eyes glued to his screen, and he shifted his position slightly, making himself even more comfortable. Jasmine felt a pang of disappointment, but she didn't give up. She knew she had every right to sit, but the longer the man ignored her, the more embarrassed she felt. She wished she didn't have to ask again, but there she was, standing and waiting for a simple gesture of kindness that seemed out of reach. Around her, the other passengers shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided looking at the scene, while others tried to pretend they didn't notice. But Jasmine knew they could see. They were all watching. She could feel their eyes on her, but no one spoke up. It was as if they were all waiting for someone else to take the first step. Jasmine stood there, her feet aching, feeling the weight of her pregnancy pull at her with every passing second. The train swayed gently as it moved along the tracks, but nothing could ease the pressure she felt on her back and in her legs. Her hands rested lightly on her stomach, trying to comfort the baby inside her, but the discomfort of standing for so long made it hard to focus on anything else. She glanced down the aisle, hoping to see an empty seat somewhere else, but it was the same. The train was packed. She turned her attention back to the man sitting in the seat. His face remained completely uninterested, as if he couldn't care less about the situation around him. He didn't even look up when she spoke, his eyes fixed firmly on his phone. Jasmine could feel her pulse quicken with frustration. She couldn't believe he wasn't acknowledging her request. The train was full, and there was no way she could stand for the next several stops, not in her condition. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, trying to find a more comfortable position, but it was no use. It wasn't just the fact that he wasn't offering her a seat that upset her. It was the way he ignored her completely. He didn't even seem to care that she had asked politely. Jasmine had always believed in kindness and respect, and she had tried to ask with the same courtesy she would expect from others. But here, in this small moment, the simple act of asking for help felt like a battle. Jasmine's hand rested a little more firmly on her stomach as she felt the baby shift. It was a reminder of why she was asking for a seat in the first place. She wasn't asking for special treatment, just the simple kindness that should come naturally in situations like this. But the man, oblivious to her discomfort, didn't even seem to notice her struggle. The train rumbled on, and the crowd continued to shift around her. But still, the man didn't budge. She let out a small sigh, trying to keep her emotions in check. There were still so many people watching, though none of them seemed willing to intervene. Some passengers looked away, trying to avoid making eye contact, as if pretending nothing was happening would make it go away. It was as if everyone on the train was waiting for someone else to take charge, to step up and do the right thing. For a moment, Jasmine thought about just giving up, sitting down in the empty space on the floor and making the best of it. But she couldn't. Not when she knew she deserved better than this. Not when she knew that asking for help shouldn't be this difficult. She shifted her weight again, her body growing more tired by the second. But still, she stood tall, trying to maintain her dignity. It felt like time was stretching, each second dragging on as she stood there. Finally, Jasmine took a deep breath and decided to try once more. This time, she spoke with more authority, her voice steady but firm. "Please, sir, could you give me your seat? I'm pregnant, and it's becoming difficult for me to stand." But still, the man didn't look up. His indifference was like a wall she couldn't break through. The train's noise, the sway of the car, the discomfort of standing all mixed together. And Jasmine could feel herself starting to lose her patience. How could one person be so blind to the needs of others? How could someone be so lost in their own world that they couldn't see someone else's struggle? As the minutes ticked by, Jasmine couldn't help but wonder how much longer she could endure. She felt her body aching more with every passing moment, but she kept her head high. There had to be a way to get through to him. The tension in the train car grew heavier with each passing moment. Jasmine could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her, but it wasn't just the physical discomfort that made her heart race. It was the feeling of being invisible, of being ignored by the very person who should have shown the most basic decency. She could sense the eyes of the other passengers on her, some of them trying to avoid the uncomfortable scene unfolding before them, while others subtly glanced over, unsure whether to intervene. It was as if everyone was waiting for someone else to do something, as though it was too awkward to step in and challenge the man's behavior. There were a few people who glanced at her sympathetically, but none of them made a move. They looked away quickly, perhaps hoping the moment would pass without any real conflict. Jasmine felt a pang of frustration at their indifference. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about the way people stood by and watched, as if her struggle wasn't worth their time. The moments seemed to drag on, each second feeling longer than the last. The man sitting in the seat still hadn't moved. He was so absorbed in his phone that it seemed as if he hadn't even noticed how uncomfortable everyone was around him. His body was hunched over, focused on whatever was on his screen, and it became clear to Jasmine that he wasn't going to do anything unless he was forced to. It made her stomach twist with a mix of disbelief and disappointment. The train began to slow as it approached the next station. Jasmine held on to the pole, hoping for some relief, but the crowd in the car only thickened as more people entered. There was no way she could stand here much longer. She felt her legs beginning to tremble, the pressure on her back intensifying. It was getting harder to maintain her balance, but still, no one seemed to care enough to speak up. Then, from the corner of her eye, she noticed something. A young man standing by the door, his attention caught by the interaction between Jasmine and the man in the seat. He looked like he was in his mid-20s, wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, and his face seemed thoughtful as he watched what was happening. He hadn't spoken up yet, but Jasmine noticed the way his eyes narrowed as he saw how the situation was unfolding. There was something in his gaze that told her he wasn't going to just stand by and let this continue. Jasmine tried to steady her breathing, trying to focus on the small victories in the situation. At least she wasn't alone. At least there was someone else who saw what was happening. She tried to ignore the overwhelming exhaustion pulling at her, but it wasn't easy. Every time the train jerked or swayed, her body screamed in protest. Then, as the train came to a halt at the next station, the young man finally moved. His footsteps were light, but purposeful. He didn't approach directly, but he stopped close to where the man was sitting, his body facing in a way that made it clear he was observing everything. His presence seemed to shift the energy in the car. People who had been watching from the sidelines began to shift their weight as well, some looking from one person to the next, unsure of what would happen next. Jasmine, still standing, noticed how the tension in the air suddenly felt like it could break. The man sitting in the seat shifted slightly, but still didn't look up. He was either oblivious to the growing unease or simply choosing to ignore it. Whatever it was, Jasmine knew something had to change. Something had to be done. The young man's gaze met hers for a brief moment, and in that fleeting exchange, she felt a spark of hope, as though maybe, just maybe, someone would finally stand up for what was right. The young man took a step closer to the man sitting in the seat, his presence now more noticeable. He wasn't rushing, but there was a quiet confidence in the way he carried himself. He paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the train car, taking in the passengers who were still quietly watching the situation unfold. A few people shifted uncomfortably, while others focused more intently on the young man, wondering what he was going to do next. It felt like the whole train was holding its breath. Jasmine, though tired and aching, couldn't help but notice the change in the atmosphere. There was something about the young man that felt different from the others. He wasn't just standing by. He was ready to do something. She felt a glimmer of hope, a small spark in her chest. Maybe she wasn't alone in this after all. The young man, who had been quietly observing, now spoke. His voice was calm but firm, cutting through the noise of the train and the murmur of passengers. "Hey, sir," he said, addressing the man in the seat, "don't you think it's time to offer this woman your seat?" The man sitting in the seat looked up from his phone, startled by the interruption. He seemed confused at first, as if he couldn't quite register what had just been said. His eyes moved between the young man and Jasmine, still standing in the aisle, visibly pregnant and struggling. For a brief moment, the train car seemed to quiet even further, as if everyone was waiting to see how he would respond. Jasmine could feel the weight of the moment. She wasn't sure what the man would say. Would he argue? Would he ignore the young man just as he had ignored her? She held her breath, watching intently as the man slowly lowered his phone, his eyes narrowing as he met the young man's gaze. "You're talking to me." The man's voice was dismissive, and there was a touch of irritation in his tone. He hadn't yet stood up, and Jasmine could feel the tension rising again. He wasn't ready to back down, not yet. The young man didn't flinch. His posture remained steady, his gaze unwavering. "Yes, I'm talking to you," he said firmly. "This woman is pregnant. She's clearly uncomfortable and needs to sit down. It's not just polite. It's the right thing to do." The man in the seat's expression changed, though it was hard to tell if it was out of embarrassment or annoyance. He shifted again, this time slowly, almost reluctantly. "I'm not getting up," he muttered under his breath, his words barely audible over the noise of the train. But something had shifted. The quiet conversation between the two men had caught the attention of the other passengers, and slowly they began to murmur among themselves. Jasmine could see a few people looking at her, then back at the man in the seat, a mix of sympathy and disapproval in their expressions. Some passengers seemed to feel guilty for not stepping in earlier, while others looked at the man as if they expected him to do the right thing. The young man was still standing by the seat, not backing down. He didn't raise his voice, but his words carried an undeniable weight. "You're not just hurting her," he said calmly. "You're hurting yourself. A person's worth isn't measured by what they have or what they think they deserve. It's in how they treat others. Don't let your pride be more important than what's right." There was a long silence in the train car. The word hung in the air, and Jasmine could see the wheels turning in the man's mind. He looked from the young man back to Jasmine, who was still standing, trying to hold herself together. Her legs were tired, her back aching, but she kept her posture straight, Unwilling to show weakness, she refused to let this man see how much his indifference had hurt her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man sighed, a heavy exhale that seemed to carry his reluctance. He stood up slowly, making a show of it, as if it took him an immense effort. "Fine," he muttered. "You can sit." Jasmine, though still weary, couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over her as she sat down in the seat. She smiled at the young man, silently thanking him for his courage and kindness. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about the principle of standing up for what was right, even when it seemed difficult. As the train continued its journey, Jasmine leaned back in the seat, her body finally finding a little comfort, but her mind was still reeling from the exchange. The incident had caused a ripple in the atmosphere of the train, and she could feel that the other passengers were now more aware, more attentive to the little things around them. The young man's simple intervention had turned a moment of discomfort into one of unexpected change. As Jasmine sat down, her legs finally relieved from the strain of standing, she felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The train hummed along the tracks, the rhythmic motion easing some of the tension in her back, though she couldn't completely relax. Her mind was still caught in the moment that had just passed. She couldn't help but reflect on the young man who had stepped up for her, a stranger in the crowd who hadn't hesitated to speak out when it mattered most. For a brief moment, she looked around the train, her eyes scanning the faces of the other passengers. Some were still looking in her direction, and she could feel their gaze, as if they were processing what had just happened. There was a quiet shift in the atmosphere, something that felt both subtle and significant. A few passengers exchanged glances, while others looked down, seemingly uncomfortable. Jasmine could sense that the young man's intervention had made an impression on them. Perhaps it was the courage to speak up, or maybe the awareness that they, too, had a role in what was happening around them. Jasmine's heart swelled with gratitude, but it was more than just the kindness the young man had shown. It was the recognition that, for once, someone had seen her, not just as a pregnant woman, but as a person deserving of respect. In the past, there had been so many moments like this where she had been ignored, dismissed, or even looked down upon. It wasn't always as overt as what had happened on the train, but it was there, an undercurrent of indifference that she had grown used to. But in this moment, she felt seen. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The man who had refused to give up his seat had remained standing, his posture rigid and uncomfortable. Jasmine noticed that he seemed to be fidgeting, his eyes darting around as though trying to avoid the lingering gaze of the other passengers. The young man who had spoken up stood a little further away now, leaning against a pole with his arms crossed, his expression calm and composed. It was clear that he wasn't looking for praise. He had acted because it was the right thing to do. And now he was content to let the situation settle on its own. As the train made its way through the city, the initial tension started to fade. The man who had been so reluctant to give up his seat was no longer the center of attention, but his discomfort was still palpable. The silence in the car was no longer as thick. Passengers had resumed their conversations, their attention diverted elsewhere. But Jasmine knew that something had changed. It wasn't just the act of giving up a seat. It was the message that had been sent to everyone on that train. Standing up for someone else was more important than ignoring what was right. The train stopped at the next station, and a few people got off. More passengers filed in, adding to the crowd. Jasmine shifted in her seat, trying to get more comfortable, but the thought of what had just happened still lingered in her mind. She had been surrounded by so many strangers, yet for a brief moment, there had been a sense of unity, a sense of shared understanding. The young man, still standing near the door, caught her eye again. He smiled at her, brief but sincere, and she returned the gesture, her tired eyes softening. She wanted to thank him, to say something, but the words didn't seem to come. There was something so powerful about the way he had simply done what was right without expecting anything in return. It was a reminder that even in moments of frustration, there were people out there who would step up, people who cared. As the train continued its journey, Jasmine felt a renewed sense of hope. It wasn't just about the kindness she had received. It was about the fact that, despite the challenges she faced every day, there were still people who cared, people who would stand up for what was right when it mattered. She didn't feel as alone as she had before, and that made all the difference. The train ride, which had started as just another exhausting trip home, had turned into something more. It had reminded her of the power of kindness, of speaking up, and of the quiet strength that existed within the people around her. As the train continued on its route, the atmosphere inside the car seemed to settle into a quieter, more comfortable rhythm. The initial tension that had gripped the passengers had eased, but it hadn't disappeared entirely. Jasmine remained seated, her hands gently resting on her swollen belly, trying to ease the discomfort that still lingered in her back and legs. She glanced around, catching sight of the man who had given up his seat for her, still standing, looking slightly awkward and unsure of where to place his hands. His gaze was focused on the floor, as if he were trying to make himself invisible. The young man who had spoken up earlier had moved toward the far end of the train. His posture relaxed as he leaned against a pole. He seemed unfazed by the attention his actions had drawn, as though doing the right thing had been second nature to him. Jasmine couldn't help but admire his calmness. There was something about the way he carried himself, unassuming but firm, that made her feel a sense of reassurance. It wasn't just his words. It was the way he had acted with purpose, not looking for validation but doing what needed to be done. For a moment, Jasmine let her thoughts drift, reflecting on the kindness she had experienced. It was such a simple gesture, really, just offering a seat to someone who needed it, but it had meant so much more than that. It was a reminder that kindness still existed, even in places that sometimes felt indifferent. There were still people in the world who saw beyond the surface, who recognized the struggles of others, and were willing to help. Jasmine's heart swelled with gratitude, not just for the young man who had intervened, but for the others who had silently witnessed the exchange. Some had avoided making eye contact, but others had looked on with a mix of concern and empathy. She couldn't help but wonder if they, too, had learned something in that brief moment. As the train continued its journey, a new stop approached. More people began to shuffle around, moving to get off or find a seat. Jasmine could feel the subtle shift in the car as more passengers filed in. She noticed that the man who had been sitting earlier was still standing near the door, looking a little less certain than before. His shoulders were slightly hunched, and he had his hands stuffed deep into his pockets, avoiding eye contact with anyone. He was no longer the center of attention, but something had changed in him, something Jasmine could sense. He was no longer the man who had been so quick to dismiss her request. Instead, he seemed to be lost in his own thoughts, perhaps reconsidering his actions. Jasmine took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment slowly settle into a peaceful silence. It wasn't that she was angry anymore. It was more like a quiet understanding had washed over her. The young man had made a difference, not just for her, but for everyone in the train car. She felt grateful for the support, but more than that, she felt empowered. Her initial frustration had turned into a reminder of the power of standing up for what was right, even when it felt like no one was paying attention. She glanced toward the young man again, who was still standing near the far end of the train. He caught her eye for a moment and smiled at her, that same warm and sincere smile. She smiled back, feeling a sense of connection. There were no words needed between them, just the quiet acknowledgement of a shared experience. He had helped her in a way that went beyond the physical act of offering a seat. He had shown her that sometimes all it took was one person to make a stand and show others the way. Jasmine closed her eyes for a moment, letting the peaceful rhythm of the train wash over her. She didn't know what the rest of the day would bring, but for now, she felt a little lighter. The world around her, despite its challenges, still had moments of kindness and compassion. She was reminded of the strength that lay in each small act of care, and that perhaps made all the difference. As the train continued to make its way through the city, the noise of the crowded car began to feel more like a distant hum. Jasmine sat back in her seat, still processing what had happened. She could feel the rhythm of the train as it swayed gently back and forth. But it wasn't just the movement of the train that made her feel calm. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had stood her ground, even if only for a moment. The situation hadn't unfolded as she had expected, but she was grateful for the unexpected twist that had turned things around. The young man, who had intervened so confidently on her behalf, was now standing near the door, looking out the window. He seemed content, though he hadn't sought any attention for his actions. Jasmine noticed that he wasn't looking for recognition or praise. He had acted simply because it was the right thing to do. He hadn't waited for anyone else to step in, and that made all the difference. In a world where people often hesitate to speak up, his bravery stood out like a beacon. Jasmine felt a warmth in her chest as she thought about what he had done. She had been in so many situations where people turned a blind eye to her struggles, where she had asked for help and been ignored. It had become a familiar pattern. But today, in this small moment, someone had chosen to do what was right. She knew it wasn't just about the seat. It was about how people had the power to make the world a little more kind, just by acting when it mattered. And that was something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of murmuring from the other passengers. She looked around and saw that many of them were engaged in quiet conversations, their voices low, but the energy in the car felt different. The incident with the man had sparked something in the passengers, something that couldn't be easily ignored. People had begun to look at each other, some even nodding in understanding. Jasmine could tell that the young man's intervention had made an impact. It had shifted something, not just for her, but for everyone on that train. The man who had initially refused to give up his seat was now standing near the door as well. He seemed to shrink in on himself, no longer as confident or dismissive as before. His face was slightly flushed, and his eyes darted nervously as if he was aware that the other passengers had seen what had happened. Jasmine couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction at the change in him. He wasn't the same man who had ignored her request just moments ago. Something had shifted, even if he didn't fully understand it yet. For the rest of the ride, the train felt quieter than usual, the passengers now more conscious of each other's presence. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was more like a collective moment of reflection. Jasmine could feel the weight of the unspoken thoughts hanging in the air. She wasn't sure if the others felt it too, but she sensed that something important had happened in that small exchange, something that couldn't easily be brushed aside. As the train neared the next station, Jasmine began to prepare herself to get off. She felt a renewed sense of purpose, like something inside her had been reawakened. It wasn't just about the kindness of a stranger or the discomfort of standing on a crowded train. It was about how one person's actions could ripple through a space, shifting the energy and causing others to think about the world around them. The young man's kindness had reminded her that small moments could have big impacts. It wasn't always about grand gestures or acts of heroism. Sometimes it was about being present, speaking up when it mattered, and showing compassion when others needed it. And in that moment, Jasmine knew she had witnessed something powerful. It wasn't just the young man's act of kindness. It was the way it had made her, and perhaps the others, see the world a little differently. She couldn't help but feel a quiet hope as she prepared to leave the train, knowing that sometimes change could start with just one person speaking out. As Jasmine stood up to gather her things, she felt a mix of emotions. The train was slowing down as it approached her stop, but the events of the ride had left a lasting impression on her. She had walked into the train that afternoon feeling like just another face in the crowd, unnoticed and ignored. But by the time her stop came, she felt different, empowered, even. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. It was about the reminder that people could choose kindness, and that sometimes standing up for what was right could make all the difference. As she made her way toward the door, Jasmine glanced around the train car once more. The passengers had shifted, their faces no longer as absorbed in their phones or books. A few people were still standing, but the tension had lifted. There was a quiet energy in the air, almost like a subtle shift in the collective atmosphere. Jasmine couldn't help but wonder if the young man's act of speaking up had made them rethink their own actions, or at least reminded them of the importance of empathy and support. She caught a few people's eyes, and some of them gave her soft, understanding nods. It was as if they too had experienced something that had changed them, even in that small moment. The man who had refused to give up his seat was still standing near the door, but now he wasn't as stiff as before. He looked less defensive and more thoughtful, almost as if he had been reflecting on what had transpired. There was a certain shift in his demeanor. He wasn't the same man who had ignored her request earlier. Jasmine didn't know if he would ever truly understand the impact of his actions, but she couldn't help but feel that the experience had planted a seed in him. Sometimes, it only took a moment for someone to reconsider their perspective, to question their own behavior, and perhaps that was what had happened here. Jasmine felt the train come to a stop, and as the doors opened, she stepped out onto the platform. The cool air hit her face, refreshing after the stuffiness of the crowded train car. As she walked away from the station, her heart felt a little lighter. She wasn't sure how long it would take for the lessons of the day to settle into the minds of the passengers, or if they would even think about it again once they left the train. But Jasmine knew that she had witnessed something important. It wasn't about the physical seat or the discomfort she had felt. It was about the power of standing up, of having someone speak out when others wouldn't. That simple act had made the world feel a little more just, a little more compassionate. As Jasmine walked down the street toward her home, her thoughts turned to the young man who had stepped in when no one else did. She wondered who he was, what his life was like, and whether he knew how much his actions had meant. But it didn't matter, because in that brief encounter, he had reminded her of something fundamental, that even small acts of kindness could change a moment, and in turn, change the way people saw the world. The day had started like any other, but by the time it ended, Jasmine felt more hopeful. She realized that even in a world full of indifference, there were still people who cared, people who would stand up for others when it counted. And that knowledge gave her a renewed sense of strength, a reminder that no matter how small the act, kindness could ripple through the world in ways that might never be fully understood but would always be felt. As she reached her front door, she took a deep breath, grateful for the day's unexpected lesson. It wasn't just about what happened on the train. It was about the idea that every person had the ability to make a difference, one simple, compassionate act at a time.